The
Please
golden
allow me to take
afternoon
care of
light
the
poured
three
through
you
the
and your
windows of
daughter.
the Riverside
Thank you, sir,
Bistro
but
when
we couldn't
Marcus Davis
accept.
saw them a weary young woman in a faded dress and a little girl with tangled curls staring at the food she couldn't afford. In that instant, the polished man of success became the boy who once went hungry. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? Marcus Davis had built a life that looked, from the outside, perfectly steady. His consulting firm ran smoothly. The office on Main Street glowed every evening with neat rows of computers and quiet confidence. But under the polish, the memory of leaner years still lived inside him. He remembered the nights he'd counted pennies at a gas station, the fear that his baby daughter might not eat enough. That memory never left. It lived in his bones, whispering reminders of who he used to be. That afternoon, he was sitting with his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, at the Riverside Bistro, a small place near the Boone River that still smelled faintly of fried food and coffee. The late autumn light poured through the wide windows, soft and golden, catching the steam that rose from plates. The waitress, cheerful and tired, refilled his coffee cup. Marcus smiled politely, grateful for the warmth, for the feeling of normalcy. Then, near the door, movement caught his eye. A young woman in a faded blue dress stood at the hostess stand, a little girl clutching her hand. The child couldn't have been more than 6. Blonde curls framed a face too solemn for her age. The woman studied the menu like someone doing math in her head, each number on the page heavy with consequence. Marcus knew that look, hunger disguised as control, survival wrapped in dignity. Lily was happily stabbing a chicken tender with her fork when she noticed the small girl staring at her plate. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is that little girl looking at my food?" Marcus felt something shift inside him, a slow tightening around his chest. He leaned closer to Lily and said softly, "Maybe she's just curious, sweetheart." But he knew better. He'd worn that same expression once standing outside a bakery window, baby Lily in his arms, counting coins that would never be enough. Across the room, the woman spoke quietly to the waiter, her tones soft but firm. When the man returned, she reached into her purse, pulling out a few crumpled bills and coins, her hands trembling. The waiter bent slightly, murmuring something Marcus couldn't hear. The woman's shoulders tensed, and in one quick motion, she rose, took the little girl's hand, and turned toward the door. Marcus was already on his feet before he'd even decided to move. "Stay here, honey," he told Lily gently. He crossed the dining room, heart thudding, reaching the entrance just as the woman pushed the door open. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice softer than he expected. "Wait, please." The woman stopped, but didn't turn right away. When she finally looked back, her eyes were cautious, the guarded eyes of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from strangers. "I thought maybe you and your daughter might like to join us for lunch," Marcus said. "We have plenty." Her reply came fast, like a shield snapping up. "No, we're fine." "I didn't mean to offend," he started. But she cut him off. "I said we don't need your charity." For a moment, their eyes locked, his full of quiet concern, hers burning with pride and pain. Then she turned, pulling the little girl out into the cold afternoon. The bell above the door jingled softly behind them, leaving Marcus standing in the draft. He returned to his table, feeling strangely helpless. Lily looked up, her brow furrowed. "Is the little girl okay, Daddy?" "I hope so," Marcus said, his voice low. He glanced out the window, watching them walk down the sidewalk, 2 figures huddled together against the wind. He could tell from the woman's posture that she was carrying more than hunger. She was carrying history. He stirred his coffee, but his mind wasn't in the restaurant anymore. He remembered the man who had once offered him help when he needed it most, a restaurant owner named George who had handed him a dishwashing job without pity, just respect. That man's kindness had built the foundation of Marcus's entire life. Now, as he sat there, his daughter's meal growing cold, Marcus realized he was standing at a crossroads. The same one George had stood at years ago when he'd chosen to help a struggling young father. He exhaled slowly, feeling the old ache of empathy returning, the one he'd tried to bury beneath success. "Sometimes," he murmured to himself, "life gives you a second chance to do what someone once did for you." Outside, the woman and her daughter disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the crowd. Marcus looked at Lily and smiled faintly. "Finish your lunch, sweetheart," he said. "I think we just met someone important." Lily tilted her head, puzzled. "Who?" He looked toward the door, where the bell had stopped ringing but the echo lingered. "Someone who needs a door opened," he said softly. The afternoon faded into soft gray light by the time Marcus and Lily stepped outside. The wind had picked up along King Street, carrying the scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe. Lily clutched his hand tightly as they crossed toward the parking lot, her small sneakers splashing through shallow puddles. Marcus scanned the sidewalks, hoping to spot the woman and her daughter, but they were gone, vanished into Boone's slow-moving crowd of college students and shopgoers. For a long moment he just stood there, uncertain what he could possibly do next. "Daddy?" Lily asked, tugging his sleeve. "Are you sad?" He smiled down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "No, sweetheart. Just thinking." They walked toward their truck, the sound of traffic humming softly behind them. Marcus had never been one for grand gestures. When George helped him years ago, it hadn't been with a sermon or a lecture. It was simple, direct. A man who said, "You look like someone who just needs a fair shot." That was all, and it had changed everything. As they drove home, Boone's small town lights blinked on one by one street lamps, glowing gold against the deepening dusk. Lily leaned against the window, watching them flicker past. Marcus's thoughts drifted to his own past. Tonight spent in a beat-up sedan with baby Lily sleeping in the back seat, and the weight of fear pressing down on him. He remembered the smell of detergent from the laundromat where he'd wash dishes after hours, just to earn a few more dollars. He had promised himself then that if he ever reached stability, he would never turn his eyes away from someone else's struggle. Yet here he was, comfortable, capable, and the moment had arrived. Back at their small home on the edge of town, Lily rushed inside to feed their cat, Muffin. Marcus lingered by the door, the wind brushing against his face. The faint lights of the restaurant still glowed across the river. He could almost see the woman's silhouette again, the way she had clutched her daughter's hand, the tension in her shoulders, the quickness of her refusal. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat by the kitchen table, and stared at the steam rising. The ticking clock on the wall filled the silence. "Sometimes people are afraid of kindness," he murmured to himself. Afraid it might come with a cost. Lily returned, curling into his lap. "Maybe she didn't know you were nice," she said, yawning. Marcus kissed the top of her head. "Maybe, or maybe she's been hurt before." They sat quietly for a while, the sound of wind outside mingling with the steady rhythm of the clock. He realized that his daughter had said something truer than most adults ever could. Sometimes the only bridge between two lives was time and patience. The next morning, Marcus found himself driving by the Riverside Bistro again before work. He slowed near the entrance, half expecting to see the same woman, half knowing he wouldn't. The hostess recognized him and waved, smiling. "Morning, Mr. Davis," she called out. He smiled back, but his eyes lingered on the empty sidewalk beyond. In his office later that day, between calls and client meetings, he couldn't stop thinking about them, the little girl's hungry stare, the mother's trembling hands. They had become a quiet presence in his thoughts, a shadow of unfinished business. That evening, when he picked up Lily from school, she climbed into the truck and said, "Did you find them, Daddy?" "No," he replied softly, "but maybe I will." He didn't add what he was truly thinking, that maybe the universe would give him another chance. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she whispered, "You'll help them, right?" Marcus brushed her hair back and smiled. "If I can, sweetheart. If they'll let me." When he closed her bedroom door, he paused in the hallway. On the wall hung an old framed photo of him standing beside George in front of the diner where he'd once worked. Both men were smiling, their aprons stained, their eyes tired but full of pride. Beneath the photo was a small plaque George had given him when he opened his own business. "Never forget the hands that lifted you." Marcus ran his fingers over the words. He didn't know the woman's name. He didn't know where she lived, but he knew he would see her again. Life had a strange way of circling back. He whispered into the quiet, almost as if speaking to George himself. "You showed me what real help looks like. Maybe it's my turn now." Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and rain through the open window. Somewhere in the dark streets of Boone, a woman and her little girl were trying to find their next meal, their next bit of safety. Marcus turned off the light, but the image of those two figures in the doorway stayed with him, glowing softly in his mind. He felt the stirring of purpose, an old fire reigniting after years of calm. As he stood by the window, watching the streetlights shimmer across the wet pavement, he whispered, "Sometimes, one small act can change everything." The night was silent, except for the hum of distant traffic. But Marcus felt it something shifting, the first movement of a story not yet written. And though he didn't know it yet, this quiet decision would lead him back to the woman and her daughter sooner than he could imagine. A week had passed since that afternoon at the Riverside Bistro, yet the image of the woman and her little girl still lingered in Marcus's mind. Boone had its way of holding memories, the way the mountains echoed every sound, the way the river carried secrets downstream. Some thoughts just stayed with you, circling back when you least expected. Marcus sat at his office desk, a mug of black coffee beside him, the morning light filtering through the blinds. Files were stacked neatly, numbers waiting for review, but his focus drifted. On his desk sat the old photo of George Holloway, the man who had given him a chance all those years ago. George's kind eyes seemed to be saying something, the same silent message they always had. Don't forget what it felt like. He picked up the picture frame and smiled. You'd tell me to stop thinking and do something, wouldn't you, old man? He murmured. Outside, the small town moved slowly. Cars rolled past the brick-lined sidewalks of King Street. The church bell from Street Luke's rang out the hour. Marcus leaned back in his chair, wondering where the woman might be now. Maybe she was one of those people who drift through town for a fresh start. Boone was full of them. Students, families, dreamers, and the ones just trying to survive. That evening, after closing the office, Marcus decided to take Lily for a walk by the river. The light was fading, soft orange bleeding into the water. Lily skipped ahead, her laughter floating through the cool air. Marcus followed, hands in his jacket pockets. "Daddy," Lily said suddenly, stopping near a bench. "Do you think we'll see that little girl again?" Marcus hesitated. "Maybe. The world's smaller than we think. Can we bring extra food next time?" she asked. Her words pulled a smile from him. "You've got a good heart, kiddo." They sat together on the bench, sharing a small paper bag of fries they'd picked up on the way. The sound of the river soothed the silence between them. As night deepened, Marcus found himself thinking again of his own beginning. Years ago, after his wife had passed and he'd been left with baby Lily, he had come to Boone with nothing but a duffel bag and a desperate prayer. George had found him sleeping in his car behind the diner, and without asking too many questions, offered him work. The first night Marcus washed dishes in that kitchen, George had said, "You're not taking charity, son. You're earning your next step, that's all." That simple kindness had been the difference between despair and a new beginning. And now, years later, Marcus could feel that same crossroads approaching again, only this time, he was on the other side. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep, he stood at her bedroom door for a long while, watching her breathe. The gentle rhythm reminded him of the promises he'd made in those hard years. To protect, to provide, and to pay it forward when he could. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Marcus poured himself another cup of coffee and opened the window. The cool air carried the faint scent of pine and the distant hum of the highway. Boone at night always felt honest, like the world paused just long enough for reflection. He wondered what story the woman carried. Her eyes had told him she'd known disappointment, maybe betrayal. Her refusal at the diner hadn't been pride, it had been survival. He rubbed his temple and whispered, "If only I knew her name." Just then, headlights passed by his window, casting moving shadows across the walls. For a second, the shape looked like a woman holding a child's hand. He blinked, and it was gone. He laughed softly to himself. "You're seeing ghosts now, Marcus." But in his heart, he knew it wasn't imagination. It was empathy taking shape, a pull towards something unfinished. Before heading to bed, he opened his old leather notebook, the one George had given him when he started his business. Inside the front cover, George's handwriting was still clear. "Kindness isn't charity. It's continuity." Marcus read those words twice, then 3 times, and nodded slowly. "Continuity," he whispered. "That's what this is." He closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, the wind rustled through the oaks, carrying a faint sound of children laughing somewhere far away, soft, almost imagined. And though Marcus didn't know it yet, that sound would lead him back to the park, where 2 little girls' laughter would change everything. Saturday morning arrived with a pale sky and the smell of rain still clinging to the air. Boone was quiet in that gentle way only small towns can be. Marcus decided to take Lily to Riverside Park before the weekend errands began. It had been their little ritual since she learned to swing coffee for him, cocoa for her. Laughter carried on the breeze. The park sat beside the river, framed by red maples and worn picnic tables. The playground's squeaky swings creaked in rhythm with the flowing water. As Marcus helped Lily fasten her jacket, he saw them two figures sitting on a bench under the big oak near the swings. A young woman in that same faded blue dress, and beside her, a child with familiar blonde curls. He froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Lily followed his gaze and whispered, "Daddy, it's them." "Yes," he said softly, feeling something shift inside him again. "It's them." Ugh. He didn't move closer, not yet. Instead, he sat at another bench a good distance away, giving them space. The little girl, Ellie, he thought her name might be, was laughing as she swung, her curls bouncing in the sunlight. The sound was light, unguarded, the kind of laugh that could warm even the coldest morning. The woman, Grace, watched her daughter with careful eyes. Even from across the park, Marcus could see the way her shoulders remained tight, as if always ready to protect. He recognized the posture one he had carried himself once, when every kindness felt like a risk. Lily ran to the swings, her laughter joining Ellie's. The two girls didn't need introductions. Children rarely do. Within minutes, they were playing together as though they'd been friends for years. Grace noticed, her expression softening slightly. But her gaze soon flickered toward Marcus. Their eyes met briefly across the park. She looked away, then back again, cautious but curious. Marcus smiled politely, a small, respectful nod, nothing more. He wanted her to see that he wasn't there to intrude. He just wanted her to know she wasn't invisible. Minutes passed. The sun peeked through the clouds, catching in the river's slow current. Grace seemed to weigh something in her mind. Finally, she stood and called to her daughter. "Ellie, 5 more minutes." "Yes, Mama," Ellie called back, pumping her legs harder. Grace sat back down, drawing in a breath that looked more like a decision than a sigh. Then, to Marcus's surprise, she shifted just slightly toward the empty space at the other end of his bench. Neither spoke. The quiet between them was tentative, but not hostile. The kind of quiet where words weren't necessary yet. Marcus opened a book from his coat pocket, pretending to read. Grace took out a small sketch pad, her pencil moving across the page. When the girls laughed together again, Grace glanced up. "Your daughter's very kind," she said, her voice measured, cautious but not cold. "Thank you," Marcus replied. "She's a lot like her mother was." That earned him a small nod. Grace's eyes softened, though only slightly. "You come here often?" "Most weekends. It's peaceful," he said, "and close to home." "You?" Grace hesitated. "Sometimes, when the weather's good and when work allows it." He nodded, not pressing further. The conversation drifted into quiet again, comfortable in its simplicity. The girls ran toward them, breathless and bright-eyed. "Mama, Daddy, we're best friends now," Lily declared, wrapping an arm around Ellie. Grace smiled, an expression that for the first time reached her eyes. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, her tone gentle. Marcus met her gaze again, sensing the walls between them thin just enough for something fragile and human to pass through. "They're good kids," he said quietly. "Yes," Grace agreed, her hand brushing a curl from Ellie's forehead. "They are." They both turned toward the river. The silence between them filled with the rustle of leaves and the soft laughter of their daughters. It was a still moment, simple, ordinary, but it carried the weight of something new forming. As the clouds thickened, Grace began packing her bag. "We should go," she said. Marcus nodded. "Of course, Em." She stood, calling for Ellie, but before leaving, she looked at him one more time. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not pushing." He smiled. "Take care, ma'am." When they walked away, Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, will we see them again?" Marcus looked at the space where they'd been, the swings still moving gently in the breeze. "I think so," he said. "The world has a way of bringing people back together when it's meant to." They stayed a little longer, watching the river move beneath the afternoon light. Marcus felt something new, settling in his chest. A quiet purpose, the beginning of a promise. And though he couldn't explain it, he knew this wasn't chance. It was the start of something that would test both his patience and his faith in the simple power of kindness. By the time autumn began to thin the trees along the Boone River, Marcus and Lily had turned their weekend park visits into a quiet routine. Every Saturday, the smell of cinnamon rolls from a nearby cafe floated through the air while the playground filled with laughter. Sometimes the same two figures appeared on the far bench, a woman sketching, a little girl with bright curls who always ran first to the swings. Grace Alden. He had finally heard her name one afternoon when Ellie called to her from across the grass. Just the sound of it settled into his mind like a melody that refused to leave. He never intruded, never asked questions, only nodded politely when their eyes met. Little by little, the distance between their benches seemed to shrink 20 yards the first week, then 15, then 10. On that crisp October day, the light fell in ribbons through the branches. Lily and Ellie took turns, pushing each other higher, their laughter echoing across the water. Grace sat a few feet away from Marcus, sketchbook open on her lap, pencil moving quickly. She didn't speak for a long time, and Marcus respected the silence. He read a newspaper that he wasn't really reading, pretending the rustle of the pages could hide the small pounding of his heart. When Ellie ran toward them shouting, "Mama, look! I can go higher than the trees!" Grace's mouth curved into a real smile, unpracticed but beautiful. She called back, "Not too high, sweetheart," and then laughed softly, almost embarrassed that the sound had escaped her. "That's what good mothers do," Marcus said, lowering his paper. "They worry because they love." Grace looked at him carefully, searching for mockery but finding none. Her voice was calm when she answered, "Worry comes naturally when you've lost too much." He nodded, understanding more than he should have. "I used to think worry meant weakness. Turns out it's just love wearing armor." For a moment, their eyes met two people who knew what it meant to guard hope. Ellie's laughter filled the pause between them, bridging what words could not. Grace exhaled slowly. "I remember you," she said at last. "The restaurant." "Yes," Marcus replied quietly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable that day." "I know." She closed her sketchbook, fingers tracing the worn edge. "It's just, when people offer help, it usually costs more than it gives." He didn't argue. He simply said, "That's fair." The honesty surprised her. For a second, her expression softened again, and then the guard returned. "I appreciate that you've been respectful. You didn't push." "I figured you've had enough of people pushing," he said. Grace looked back at the girls on the swings. "They seem happy." "They are," Marcus answered. "Kids don't carry the same scars we do, at least not yet." Grace's hand rested on her daughter's backpack, an unconscious gesture of protection. "Let's hope they never have to." The sky had begun to change, pale clouds streaking across the mountains, a hint of chill settling in. The wind lifted a few yellow leaves and scattered them between their benches. Grace gathered her things, hesitated, then said quietly, "We should go. Thank you for the company." Marcus rose too, nodding politely. "Anytime. You both take care." She offered a small smile, fleeting but genuine. Ellie waved enthusiastically. "Bye, Mr. Davis. Bye, Lily." "See you soon," Lily shouted back, her voice bright against the fading afternoon. Grace gave a gentle tug on her daughter's hand, and together they walked down the winding path toward town, the sound of their footsteps fading into the rustle of leaves. Marcus watched them until they disappeared behind the trees. Lily looked up at him. "Daddy, do you think they'll come back next week?" "I don't know," he said, smiling faintly. "But I hope so." As they left the park, Marcus felt something new stirring inside a fragile thread of connection that neither poverty nor pride could sever. He knew enough about pain to recognize courage when he saw it. Grace wasn't just surviving. She was fighting to keep her dignity intact. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, her question returned to him. He looked out the window at the quiet street, where porch lights glowed like tiny beacons. "I think we'll see them again," he whispered mostly to himself. "Sometimes the people we're meant to help keep crossing our path until we finally get it right." Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells from downtown Boone, slow and steady like an old heartbeat. Marcus listened until the last chime faded, a quiet promise hanging in the night air something was beginning to change. The next Saturday morning, Boone awoke under a pale gold sky. The air had that crisp edge of early November, where every breath felt like a memory of something you didn't know you missed. Marcus and Lily carried a thermos of cocoa and a paper bag of muffins as they headed toward Riverside Park, both half hoping and half pretending not to hope that they'd see Grace and Ellie again. The park was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few joggers and the hum of the river. Then, near the oak bench, Marcus spotted them. Grace sat hunched over her sketchbook, a wool scarf tucked around her neck. Ellie crouched on the grass nearby, arranging leaves by color. Lily ran ahead, squealing, "Ellie!" The two girls collided in a blur of giggles and spinning hair. Grace looked up, startled at first, then visibly relaxed when she saw Marcus's familiar figure approaching. "Morning," he said gently. She nodded. "Morning. Looks like the girls have made this their spot." "I think it's officially theirs now," he smiled. "We just get visitation rights." The line drew a faint chuckle from her. It was small, but it felt like the sun breaking through clouds. They sat a comfortable distance apart, the bench between them like a line neither seemed ready to cross. For a while, they simply watched their daughters chase each other near the swings. Marcus sipped his coffee, the steam curling into the cool air. Grace's pencil moved softly across her sketch pad. "What do you draw?" he asked finally. "Anything that helps me breathe," she said without looking up. "Sometimes faces. Sometimes things I miss." He nodded slowly. "You used to paint professionally?" She gave a quiet, almost apologetic laugh. "Once upon a time. Before a lot of things." Marcus didn't press. He just listened to the rhythm of her words, the pauses, the restraint. He knew that kind of silence, the kind that carries more truth than any long explanation. After a moment, Grace closed her sketchbook and folded her hands in her lap. "I lost my job about 2 months ago," she said, her tone steady but low. "We were staying with a friend, but it wasn't safe anymore. I thought I could handle it. Turns out pride doesn't pay rent." Marcus glanced at her, his voice soft. "I know that feeling. I used to wash dishes in a diner just down the street, back when it was all I could do to keep my little girl fed." "Ah!" She turned to him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You?" He nodded. "Me. The owner George gave me a chance when he didn't have to. Said I just looked like a man who needed a fair shot." Grace studied him, the sharpness in her gaze giving way to something gentler. "And you made it out?" "With a lot of help," Marcus said, "and a promise I never forgot." The words hung there, simple and true. The river murmured beside them. Ellie and Lily's laughter drifted through the air like music from another lifetime. Grace looked down at her hands. "You're lucky. Some people never find their George." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But sometimes George finds them." That earned him a glance that almost resembled trust. The clouds shifted, and for the first time, sunlight fell fully on her face. It softened her features, the lines of exhaustion, the quiet sorrow in her eyes, and Marcus realized how much strength it took for her just to be sitting here, still standing in her own dignity. Lily came running up, waving a leaf crown she and Ellie had made. "Look, Daddy, we made this for Miss Grace." Grace blinked in surprise as Lily placed it gently on her knee. "For me?" "Yes," Lily said proudly. "Because you look like a queen in one of those old fairy tales." "Siction." Grace laughed then, a clear, unguarded sound that made Marcus smile. It was the kind of laughter that could rebuild a soul. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, voice trembling slightly. "That's very kind." When the girls ran back to play, Grace looked down at the crown of leaves. "It's been a while since anyone made me feel like I was worth something." "You are," Marcus said quietly. "You just forgot for a while." "Ah." Her eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears away before they could fall. "You're good with words, Mr. Davis." "Not really," he replied. "Just good at recognizing people who deserve better than what life's handed them." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The silence between them this time wasn't guarded. It was warm, fragile, human. The church bells from downtown began to ring, echoing softly over the water. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, listening. "I used to go there," she said quietly, "back when I believed things could still change." "Maybe they still can," Marcus said. "Sometimes it starts with something as small as a shared park bench." Grace opened her eyes again, meeting his. There was no wall this time, only weariness and the faint spark of trust. Ellie ran up, holding a red leaf high in the air. Mama, look! It's shaped like a heart! Grace smiled, then turned to Marcus. You might be right, she said softly. As she gathered their things to leave, the girls exchanged hugs that neither parent interrupted. Grace hesitated before walking away. Thank you for listening, she said. Any time, Marcus replied. You know where to find us. She smiled, brief, real, and full of something close to hope. When she and Ellie disappeared down the path, Marcus looked at the empty bench beside him, still warm from where she had been sitting. He placed his hand on the wood, as if to hold on to the moment. Sometimes, he whispered, a story starts long before either person realizes they're in it. The wind answered softly through the trees, carrying the echo of two little girls' laughter as the scene faded into the quiet hum of Boone's evening light. The first frost came early that year. Boone's rooftop shimmered white in the morning sun, and the mountains stood wrapped in pale mist. Marcus woke to the sound of the radiator clanking, and Lily humming in the kitchen as she poured cereal. Life, for once, felt calm. But calm had a way of carrying echoes, especially for people who'd lived through chaos. He had not seen Grace and Ellie in almost 2 weeks. Work had piled up, and the weather had turned unpredictable. Yet every time he passed Riverside Park, his eyes searched the benches, just in case. The emptiness there gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. That Saturday, he finally spotted them. Grace was walking quickly down the sidewalk toward the public library, her scarf drawn tight against the wind, Ellie skipping beside her with a paper bag in hand. Marcus pulled over without really thinking. Need a lift? He called through the open window. Grace hesitated, halfway between polite refusal and weary acceptance. We're fine, she said automatically. But the wind caught her voice, scattering it into the cold air. Ellie tugged her sleeve. Mama, it's freezing. Marcus smiled. Just to the library. Promise I won't talk your ear off. Grace studied him, the lines of suspicion still there but softening. Finally, she nodded. All right, just this once. Inside the truck, the heater hummed gently. Ellie pointed at the dream catchers hanging from the rearview mirror. Did you make those? My daughter did, Marcus said, glancing at Lily's handiwork. She said they keep good dreams close. Grace gave a small laugh. Maybe we should all have one of those. Oh. At the library, Marcus offered to wait, but Grace shook her head. We'll be fine. Thank you. Again. Her gratitude sounded like it had been stored up for years and came out awkwardly, as though unused. He watched them disappear through the glass doors, feeling an ache that surprised him. Something about her, about the careful way she guarded every word, felt achingly familiar. Later that week, Boone was struck by an early snow. Roads glazed over, and the town slowed to a hush. Marcus closed the office early and took Lily to the diner for cocoa and pie. As they settled into a booth, he froze. Across the room, near the window, sat Grace and Ellie. This time, Grace looked startled to see him, then oddly relieved. Marcus waved, and she hesitated before waving back. A few minutes later, the waitress led them to the table beside his. Looks like fate's not subtle, he said, smiling. Grace shook her head, smiling faintly. Maybe Boone's just too small. They ate mostly in silence, the clink of spoons and children's chatter filling the air. Yet it felt comfortable now, familiar, almost safe. When the girls ran to the dessert counter to stare at the pies, Grace spoke quietly. I wasn't always like this, she said. Careful, distrustful. Marcus didn't reply. He knew when someone needed to pour, not to be interrupted. My husband left 3 years ago, she continued, her gaze fixed on the snow outside. Took the savings, left the bills. I kept thinking he'd come back. By the time I stopped believing, it was too late. Ellie and I were already halfway to losing everything. Marcus's chest tightened. I'm sorry, he said. She shrugged slightly. Sorry doesn't fix things, but it helps to say it out loud. She traced the rim of her mug. I tried so hard not to need anyone after that. It just felt safer that way. He nodded slowly. I understand. I used to think needing people meant being weak. But maybe it just means being human. Grace looked at him then, truly looked past the surface, into the steady patience of a man who wasn't trying to rescue her, only to see her. It unnerved her more than cruelty ever had. When the girls returned with whipped cream mustaches, laughter broke the heaviness. Grace wiped Ellie's face and whispered, You're a mess, her tone gentle. Marcus felt warmth spread through him at the sound. As they stepped outside afterward, snowflakes drifted in slow spirals. The street lamps glowed amber against the white. Grace glanced at him, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Thank you for listening again." "Any time," he said softly. Some stories deserve to be heard twice. She smiled, a real one, small but honest. Then she turned, leading Ellie toward the darkened street. Marcus watched until they vanished into the snowfall, feeling the weight of something both tender and dangerous: attachment. He knew he was crossing into territory where kindness could easily become care, and care could become something deeper. But for now, he simply let the snow fall, content to walk home through the quiet, carrying the sound of Grace's laughter like a fragile flame against the cold. 2 nights later, Marcus couldn't sleep. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a cold, perfect stillness. Boone was quiet except for the occasional crunch of tires on frozen streets. He stood by the window, watching the glow of the diner sign across the river flicker through the fog. The Holloway Diner, still carrying George's name even after all these years. It had always been a place of second chances. Something tugged at him, an intuition he didn't fully understand. He grabbed his coat, careful not to wake Lily, and stepped out into the freezing night. The streets shimmered under the soft reflection of streetlights, and the river murmured faintly beneath its icy crust. When he pushed open the door to the diner, the warmth hit him instantly, along with the familiar smell of coffee, bacon, and nostalgia. The place hadn't changed much since George's time. Same red booths, same corner jukebox, same hum of the heater. But behind the counter stood Grace. Her hair was tied up loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She wore a pale blue uniform and a weary smile, balancing 2 plates on one arm with practiced ease. When she saw him, her expression faltered not from fear this time, but from something more complicated: embarrassment, maybe even shame. "Marcus," she said softly, setting the plates down. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't sleep," he replied, his tone gentle. "And I was hungry for old memories." Grace gave a small, resigned smile. "You picked a quiet night for it." He nodded toward her apron. "So this is your new job?" "Yes," she said, exhaling. "Started last week. The night shift pays a little better. Ellie sleeps at a neighbor's apartment until I get home." Marcus felt a pang, not of pity, but of admiration. The strength it took to keep going, to rebuild quietly without fanfare, reminded him of the woman he'd once seen in his own mother. "I didn't want you to know like this," she added. "It's just work. I need it." "There's no shame in that," Marcus said. "George used to tell me the same thing when I wore that apron." She looked up sharply. "You worked here?" He smiled softly. "Right at that sink behind you. Burned my hands on dishwater more times than I can count." Something in her face shifted a quiet recognition, a bridge forming between 2 people who had stood on opposite sides of struggle. "Then you understand," she whispered. "I do," he said. "Better than you think." The jukebox clicked softly in the corner, an old country song starting to play. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the sizzle from the grill and the hum of the fluorescent lights. "You don't have to prove anything to me," Marcus said finally. "I know what it's like to fight your way back." Grace looked down at her hands. "I just didn't want you or Lily to see me like this." "Waiting tables at midnight isn't exactly the dream." "Maybe not," he said gently. "But sometimes dreams take the long road home." She met his gaze, her eyes shining faintly in the diner's dim light. "You always talk like that?" "Only when I mean it." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You sound like George. The cook here told me he used to give speeches to everyone who looked tired." "Yeah," Marcus smiled. He believed weariness was just hope with a limp. Grace chuckled, then covered her mouth quickly as if afraid to let the joy show. "That sounds like something he'd say." When her shift ended near 2 in the morning, Marcus insisted on walking her to the bus stop. The street was empty, the snow crunching under their shoes. Their breath hung in small clouds between them. "Thank you," she said, "for not making this awkward." "I wouldn't dare," he replied. "You've got enough weight to carry without mine." Grace looked at him for a long moment, the night quiet around them. "You really are different, Marcus." "Different how?" "Most people help because they want to feel good. You help because you remember what it feels like not to be." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, his throat tight. As the bus pulled up, she hesitated on the first step. then turned back. "If you ever get hungry at midnight again, come by. I make a decent apple pie." "Empli, I'll hold you to that," Marcus said. When the bus pulled away, he stood in the cold, watching the taillights fade into the dark. The wind carried the faintest echo of laughter. Grace's, soft and cautious, like someone relearning how to breathe. He smiled to himself and whispered into the quiet. "Looks like George was right again. Kindness doesn't end. It just changes hands, as in fine." And with that, Marcus turned toward home, his footprints the only ones on the snow-covered street, unaware that this night, the quiet meeting under flickering lights would be the first step toward both Grace's redemption and his own healing. The first real snowstorm of winter rolled down from the Blue Ridge like a slow, living thing. Boone went quiet beneath it. Stores shuttered early, lights dimmed behind frosted windows, and the mountains vanished behind a curtain of white. The sheriff's office had already warned everyone to stay off the roads. Marcus sat at his desk, the office empty except for the hum of the heater. Files lay scattered, but his attention drifted toward the window where flakes spiraled endlessly, burying the world in silence. He thought of Grace working the late shift again, and of Ellie sleeping somewhere in a neighbor's apartment. Something about the thought unsettled him. He packed up, locked the office, and drove carefully through the swirling snow toward the Holloway Diner. The parking lot was almost deserted. Inside, the lights glowed amber through the frost-covered windows. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, shaking snow from his coat. Grace was behind the counter, refilling coffee for a trucker who looked half asleep. When she saw Marcus, her surprise broke into a smile. "You again? You must really love pie." He grinned. "I told you I'd come back for it." "Well, you're just in time. The storm's about to trap us all in here." She nodded toward the door where snow had already begun to pile against the glass. "Then I guess I picked the right place to get stranded," he said. The trucker left a few bills and hurried out into the storm, muttering something about making it to Asheville before dawn. Grace and Marcus watched the door close, the sound of the wind pressing hard against it. Then they were alone. She leaned on the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. "You really shouldn't have driven in this. The roads are a mess." "I've seen worse," he said lightly. "Besides, the cocoa's better here." Grace shook her head, smiling. "You always have an answer, don't you?" "Only when I'm nervous," he admitted. Her brows lifted slightly, and for a moment she looked caught off guard. "Nervous? Around me?" "Maybe," Marcus said, his voice soft. "You make me want to say the right things." Grace looked down, her hands twisting the towel. "Nobody said anything kind to me in a long time. I forget how to take it." He didn't rush to fill the silence. The air between them seemed to thicken with warmth despite the cold pressing outside. The diner lights flickered once as the storm intensified, wind howling like a voice from the mountains. Then, somewhere down the street, a transformer blew. The lights went out. The diner fell into darkness except for the faint glow from the kitchen emergency lamp. Grace gasped softly. "Oh no, power's gone again." Marcus rose. "You've got candles?" She pointed toward the shelf under the counter. Together, they lit a few, their flickering flames reflecting in the windows, turning the diner into a tiny island of golden light amid the storm. When Grace sat again, her shoulders slumped, exhausted but calm. "You know," she said quietly, "the last time I was stuck somewhere like this, it was with my ex-husband. We were stranded in a motel outside Raleigh. He spent the whole night blaming me for the weather." Marcus chuckled softly. "Sounds like a charming man." "Charming when he wanted something," she replied, a shadow passing across her face. "But mostly, he just wanted control." The wind rattled the windows. Marcus waited, sensing she wasn't done. "I used to think love was about keeping someone happy," Grace said. "Now I think it's about being safe enough to be yourself." He nodded slowly. "That's the only kind that lasts." Their eyes met, and for the first time since they'd met, Grace didn't look away. There was no fear, only quiet recognition like two survivors realizing they'd been walking parallel paths through different storms. The clock ticked softly. Somewhere behind the counter, the old jukebox hummed to life, drawing power from the generator and playing a faint, warbling tune. Grace smiled faintly. "George always said that thing would outlast the apocalypse." Marcus laughed. "Guess he was right." They sat for a long while, sipping lukewarm coffee, listening to the snow. Finally, Grace whispered, "You ever think maybe we meet people for reasons we can't see yet?" "Every day," Marcus said. "George used to tell me, the right people come when you're finally ready to see them." I didn't believe it back then. Now I do. Her eyes softened, the candlelight catching them like amber glass. "Then maybe we're both just starting to see." A deep silence followed, filled only by the sound of wind and the slow melting of ice on the windows. Marcus glanced outside. "You can't walk home in this. Roads are sealed. You'll stay here until morning." Grace hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know. But I'm not leaving you here alone." Her lips parted to protest, then closed again. The words that rose in her throat turned instead into a faint, grateful smile. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the diner, the same diner where Marcus once scrubbed dishes and rebuilt his life, two people sat under candlelight, finding shelter not just from the snow, but from the loneliness that had haunted them both for years. The storm howled outside, shaking the diner windows. Marcus and Grace sat close to the candlelight, the silence between them deep and human. Grace stared at the flame. "My mom used to say storms wash everything clean. Leave only what matters." Marcus smiled. "George used to say the same." She looked up. "George, the man who owned this place?" He nodded. "He gave me my first job when Lily was a baby. Treated me like I mattered." Her eyes widened. "My mom worked for him 2 years ago. He helped us when my dad left. Paid for my school books." Marcus froze. "Then George helped us both." Grace gave a shaky laugh. "I used to do homework right there in that booth. He called me kiddo and gave me milkshakes if I finished my math. He never changed," Marcus said softly. "He just wanted people to stand on their own feet." The storm began to quiet. Grace wiped her eyes. "Maybe I came back here because some part of me remembered what kindness felt like." Marcus nodded. He'd be proud. "We're still carrying his kindness forward." Her voice trembled. "You really think it lasts that long?" "I know it does," Marcus said. "George used to tell me, goodness isn't something you finish, it's something you hand off." Grace smiled faintly. "Then maybe tonight." He handed it to us. When the power flickered back, they sat in the golden light, both silent, both changed. Grace whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." That's the only way worth seeing someone," Marcus said. Outside, dawn glowed through the snow. Two souls, once lost in their own storms, now sat in the quiet light connected by one man's kindness, still rippling years later. 3 weeks passed after the storm. Winter settled over Boone like a quiet blanket. The diner was busy again, and for the first time in years, Grace seemed lighter. Her laughter came easier. Even Ellie smiled more. Marcus often stopped by after work with Lily. The two girls played by the window while he and Grace talked over coffee. What had started as kindness now felt like something deeper, a quiet rhythm neither dared to name. But one evening, as Marcus finished locking the office, his phone rang. Grace's voice trembled on the line. "Marcus, it's Ellie. She's burning up. I'm at County General." He was already grabbing his keys. "I'm on my way." Snow whipped across the highway as he drove. Memories flooded back of nights holding baby Lily in hospital corridors, terrified and alone. When he reached the ER, Grace sat in a plastic chair, arms wrapped around herself, eyes red from crying. "They think it's pneumonia," she whispered. "She can't breathe right. I don't know how I'll pay for this." Marcus crouched beside her. "Don't worry about the bill. I'll take care of it." She shook her head, panic flashing. "No. I can't owe you," he interrupted softly. "You don't owe me anything. This isn't a favor. It's what people do when they care." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why would you do that?" "Because someone once did it for me." Grace's lips trembled, but she didn't argue. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, silent, exhausted. When the nurses called her in, Marcus stayed close. Through the glass, he watched Grace stroke Ellie's hair as the little girl drifted to sleep under oxygen tubes. He stayed until dawn, bringing her coffee, calling the billing desk, making sure everything was handled. Outside, the first light of morning touched the parking lot snow. Grace stood beside him, eyes swollen but calm. "You didn't have to stay." "I know," Marcus said quietly. But I wanted to. She looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "Maybe not everyone wants something in return." He smiled softly. "No. Some people just remember what it's like to be scared." They stood there in silence, the hospital doors sliding open behind them, releasing a breath of warm air that smelled faintly of hope. Ellie stayed in the hospital 3 nights. The fever finally broke on the second morning, and by the third, she was sitting up, drawing pictures with the crayons Marcus had brought. Each time Grace looked at her daughter breathing easily again, her eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. Marcus came every day, quietly. He never brought flowers or made grand gestures, just coffee, sandwiches, and his steady presence. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They didn't need to. His calmness filled the space that fear had emptied. Late one evening, Grace said softly, "You remind me of George. He used to show up the same way quietly, when people needed it most." Marcus smiled. "He taught me that showing up is what matters. Words fade, actions stay." She looked down, fingers tracing the edge of her paper cup. "I spent years thinking help was just another kind of control. But you've shown me something different." "I'm glad," he said, "because Ellie deserves a mother who isn't afraid of kindness." Grace's eyes shone in the dim hospital light. "And you deserve peace for what you've carried all these years." They sat there, sharing a silence that felt sacred. When Ellie was discharged, Marcus drove them home. Snow still lined the sidewalks, but the air was softer, touched by sunlight. Grace stopped before her apartment door, turning to him. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Don't," he replied. "Thank me by living without fear again." She smiled, quiet, genuine, free from the old weight. "I'll try." He nodded. "That's enough." Inside, Ellie waved from the window as he walked to his truck. "Bye, Mr. Marcus. Mama says you're our friend." He turned, smiling. "Your mama's right." Grace stood behind her daughter, one hand resting on Ellie's shoulder. Their eyes met through the glass, 2 people changed by kindness, each finding light after years of darkness. As Marcus drove away, he felt the strange calm of something mended, not fixed, just whole again. Sometimes redemption didn't come with fireworks. It came quietly, in hospital halls, in small acts that told someone, "You're not alone anymore." Spring arrived quietly in Boone. The snow melted from the rooftops, and tulips sprouted along Main Street. Grace had been working mornings at Marcus's firm for 3 months now. Her posture was straighter. Her eyes carried light again. At the office, she moved with calm confidence, organizing schedules, greeting clients, laughing with coworkers. Marcus noticed how she now smiled easily, like someone who had finally remembered her own worth. One afternoon after a meeting, she knocked on his office door. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," he said, setting his pen down. Grace sat, nervous but determined. "I've been saving a little money. There's a single mom at Ellie's school. She's struggling like I was. I want to help her, but I don't know how without making her feel small." Marcus smiled, touched. "Start with something simple. Buy her daughter new shoes, or invite them for dinner. Don't make it a rescue, make it friendship." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "That's what George did, isn't it? And what you did for me," he smiled. "That's how kindness works. It's not a favor, it's a circle." For a moment, Grace looked out the window at the sun-drenched hills. "I used to think being helped meant I'd failed. Now I know it means I wasn't alone." "Exactly," Marcus said. "Now it's your turn to show someone else that truth." She stood, her smile quiet but full of strength. "Then I'll start this weekend." As she left his office, Marcus leaned back, feeling an ache of pride. Watching her rebuild had reminded him of George's lessons that real redemption wasn't about saying sorry, but about creating good where pain once lived. Outside, he saw Grace walking toward her car, sunlight catching her hair. Ellie waited beside her, holding a small box wrapped in ribbon inside, a new pair of shoes for another little girl. Marcus smiled. The circle was turning again. Saturday afternoon, Boone was alive with sunshine. The farmer's market filled the square. Children ran between stalls, and the air smelled of baked bread and tulips. Grace stood across the street from the schoolyard, holding Ellie's hand and a small gift bag. "Are you nervous, Mama?" Ellie asked. "A little," Grace admitted. "But sometimes doing the right thing feels that way." They crossed to a modest apartment complex. On the steps sat a woman in her 30s, tired but kind-eyed, mending a torn backpack. Her daughter played beside her with worn-out sneakers full of holes. Grace approached with a warm smile. "Hi, I'm Grace. Our daughters go to the same school. I noticed these might fit her." She handed the bag gently, her tone casual, respectful. No pressure, just something Ellie picked out. The woman blinked, speechless. Then tears welled up. I don't know what to say." Grace shook her head. "You don't have to say anything. Just let her run without worrying about the ground." And the woman smiled through her tears. "Thank you." When they walked away, Ellie looked up. "That felt nice, Mama." Grace squeezed her hand. "It does, doesn't it? That's how kindness works. It makes two hearts lighter." Across the street, Marcus watched from his truck. He hadn't meant to follow, but something told him to be there. Seeing Grace offer help with such grace and dignity filled him with quiet pride. George's words echoed in his mind. "Don't save people. Stand beside them until they can save others." As Grace and Ellie turned the corner, Marcus whispered, "You did it, George. She's carrying it forward." That evening, Grace left a small envelope on Marcus's desk. Inside was a handwritten note. "You once told me kindness is a circle. Today I learned what that means. Thank you for trusting me to find my own way to give back." Marcus smiled, folded the note carefully, and placed it beside George's old photo. Outside, the sunset turned Boone streets gold. Somewhere, two little girls laughed, their footsteps light on the pavement, proof that love, when given freely, never stops moving. Spring drifted into early summer, and Boone glowed with quiet life. The diner's windows were open again, letting in birdsong and the smell of coffee. Marcus sat at his usual booth, papers spread before him but forgotten. He was watching Grace laugh with the morning customers, moving with an ease that had taken months and a lifetime to reclaim. Lily and Ellie were at the counter, sharing a milkshake, their giggles echoing through the room. To anyone else, it was just an ordinary Saturday. To Marcus, it was the proof of everything George had taught him. When Grace noticed him watching, she brought him a refill. "You're early today," she said. He smiled. "Couldn't sleep. Too much peace, maybe." She laughed softly. "That's a good problem." They sat for a moment in companionable silence. Sunlight glinted off the old photo frame above the counter George and Marcus years ago. Standing outside this same diner, Grace noticed it and smiled. "He'd be proud, you know, of what you've done here." Marcus followed her gaze. "He's the reason I ever learned how to give." Grace tilted her head. "And you taught me that giving doesn't mean losing yourself. It's just remembering who you are." Her words settled in his chest like a quiet truth. Later that afternoon, the four of them walked through Boone's Park. The girls ran ahead, chasing butterflies near the swings. Grace and Marcus lingered behind, their steps slow, the kind of rhythm that didn't need words. Grace said, "Sometimes I think about how small it all started. A little girl staring at a plate of chicken tenders." Marcus chuckled. "And a stubborn woman refusing lunch. I wasn't proud of that," she admitted, "but maybe I needed to learn that not every offer hides a trap." He nodded. "And I needed to remember that helping isn't about fixing, it's about faith." They stopped by the bench where they'd first spoken months ago. Grace brushed her hand along the wood. "You ever wonder what George would say if he saw us now?" Marcus smiled gently. "Probably that we're both late for work." Grace laughed, a real bright sound that turned heads nearby. Marcus joined in, and for the first time in years, he felt weightless. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, Lily and Ellie ran back, holding wildflowers. "For you!" they shouted, handing them to Grace. She knelt, hugging them both, her eyes glistening. Marcus watched the three of them, his daughter, her daughter, and the woman who had walked through her own storm and found light again. He realized then that redemption wasn't something you claimed, it was something you lived, one day at a time, through the people you chose to stand beside. That night, Boone was quiet again. The lights from the diner glowed faintly through Marcus's window, the same way they had when George was still alive. Lily was asleep down the hall, her soft breathing mixing with the hum of spring rain against the glass. Marcus sat at his desk, an old photo spread before him. George, young and broad-shouldered, his arm draped across Marcus's back the day he'd been hired. The edges were frayed, the ink fading, but the warmth in George's smile remained as vivid as ever. He whispered, "I think we did it, George." He thought of Grace and Ellie safe, smiling, rebuilding, of the small acts now multiplying across Boone, a neighbor sharing groceries, a stranger paying for coffee, a woman leaving shoes for a child, each one a quiet echo of something George had started long ago. Marcus felt peace, not pride, but the calm that comes when a promise has been kept. He had paid forward what was once given to him. He closed the photo frame gently and went to check on Lily. She stirred in her sleep and murmured, "Daddy, did you help someone today?" He smiled, brushing her hair from her face. "I think so, sweetheart, and they helped me too." As he turned off the light, moonlight spilled through the curtains, soft, silver, eternal. Somewhere across town, Grace whispered goodnight to Ellie, and two little girls dreamed without worry. The circle was complete, but it would keep turning through every small kindness that followed, through every heart that remembered. Because true redemption doesn't end with one person's story. It continues quietly, endlessly, wherever compassion chooses to live. Sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. A man who once washed dishes in a small-town diner found himself, years later, watching another single parent rediscover hope in that very same place. What began as a simple offer of help became a bridge between two souls, one learning to trust again, the other remembering that compassion is the truest form of strength. The laughter of their daughters, the smell of fresh coffee, and the glow of dawn over Boone were proof that healing rarely arrives with thunder. It comes softly through presence, patience, and the courage to care. As we grow older, we come to see that life's real wealth isn't found in bank accounts or polished titles. It lives in shared meals, in a neighbor's knock on a stormy night, in the hand that reaches back when you stumble. Marcus didn't save Grace. He simply stood beside her until she could stand again. And through that simple act, both of them found family where they least expected it. Lesson: love and redemption are not grand gestures. They are the steady rhythm of kindness that shapes every ordinary day. A single moment of genuine care can change the direction of a life. Just like the porch light that stays on long after everyone has gone to bed, quiet goodness can still guide us through our darkest roads. Perhaps that's the message George left behind, and the one Marcus and Grace carried forward. Anyone can be the light in someone else's window. It only takes one act of empathy, one open heart, to remind us that we all belong to the same human family. So, dear listener, as you sip your evening tea or sit beneath the soft hum of your porch light, take a moment to think of the people who once helped you find your way and those who might need your warmth tonight. If this story touched your heart, press 1" the comments. If you feel there's something we could do better, press 0 and share your thoughts. Your stories, just like this one, help keep the circle of kindness alive.